You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hey, Larry.
Hello there.
Okay, welcome into the Valley Current, Larry. How you been?
I'm recovering.
You're recovering. Well, we've got you on the Zoom camera. You're looking pretty good there. You got your hair all long. You look like you're doing some hippie stuff.
Well, what you don't see is the wheelchair and the scars and the pain and the learning how to walk and learning how to be. You said you had a broken hip at one time?
Yeah, I played basketball in high school, and I guess I bent both hips in a way that caused what's called dysplasia, which just means that the tires are slightly out of alignment. So over 40 or 50 years after being a teenager, I guess it's more like 50 years, basically your hips give out and it goes bone on bone. And then what you do is you go in one operation at a time, and you're thinking, oh, well, I don't really need to do both of them. But then you learn the pain signals move. The pain that you thought was just in your left hip is really pain in both hips, but the pain in the left hip was much worse than the one on the right hip. And so the doctor said, you're going to find out you're still in pain. You'll find out the hard way. You should let me do both of them at once. I said, no, let's do one at a time. And he was right. 6 months later, I was back in number 2. So I probably could have saved some money for the medical insurance, but I did one at a time, and it ended up being a rehab process over a longer period. Did you do both at the same time?
I only broke one hip.
Okay.
But what happened was it was fractured so badly that he had to replace the ball.
Oh, brother. Did you fall?
So he replaced the ball, and then it got infected.
Ouch.
And the antibiotic didn't cure that. And I went crazy for a couple of days in the hospital.
It's not a good time to be. It's not a good time to be in the hospital right now, right?
Right. And
right.
So I now have antibiotic infusions 4 times a day.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm going to ask you some questions. You're going to do the best you can in telling us about how you got involved in the software industry, because you're one of the pioneers in the area of open source. And whenever I have an open source case, I always think, Larry would instantly have an answer to this question that often are getting more and more complex over time. And the whole open source system was meant to simplify things. I mean, that's the way I think of it, right?
Right. That's what's happened. I get questions all the time of things that I thought I answered in the first chapter of my book, and it didn't work. I couldn't get it understood. But go ahead.
Yeah.
Ask the question.
So tell me, when did you first even get interested in going to law school? Because everyone I talk to has a different explanation of how they ended up in law school. Because, I think your background didn't necessarily assume that you would go to law school, right?
Law school was a third career for me. So essentially what happened is I studied in undergraduate school. I went to Dartmouth and studied and got a degree and learned computers and helped at at that time, their computer system and their time-sharing computer system. Graduated from Dartmouth, went to University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, studied computer science there as well, and went off and became a computer programmer.
Right.
Essentially ended up with a job at Stanford University, where I was responsible for introducing database technology to the university faculty and staff and students, and worked there for a number of years, doing computer stuff, heading up various departments and managing various projects and organizing things in their computer activities, primarily related to database, but other things as well.
Right, and let's drop a footnote here that Dartmouth was at number 1. It's one of the best colleges in the world. Number 2, maybe even better than Stanford. Stanford would disagree, but number 2, I remember in the back of my head that Dartmouth had a very famous computer scientist that wrote one of the very original Fortran compilers, I want to say, or one of the PL1 or one of the early compilers was written by somebody at Dartmouth in the back of my mind. Am I right about that? Am I remembering that right?
Well, no, you're mixing a whole bunch of facts.
Okay.
Actually, what Dartmouth had was the first time-sharing system.
Okay.
And they, Dr. Kemeny and Dr. Kurtz, both professors at Dartmouth, invented a language called BASIC.
Basic. Okay. Right.
And then onto that computer, they added capability to interpret Fortran. And I, as a student, wrote the first Fortran manual for that computer.
Oh, okay. So you were right there. You were right. You were involved right there. My memory is not so bad that I could remember that they had some sort of famous history of the time sharing system that they had, right?
The very best in the world. So I knew time sharing actually before Stanford had time sharing. And then I came to Stanford and worked with them, and everyone at that point went into time sharing. And it was
what people don't realize is that the more things change, the more they stay the same, because back in those days, the idea of time sharing or sharing a bigger machine, whether it's a mainframe or a mini computer, was viewed as a really positive thing. And people were like, this is great. This is going to be so wonderful. And then there was this whole effort to sort of say, no, everyone should have their own computer. And that was the beginning of the personal computer industry, when Jobs and Wozniak came in and said, hey, we want to break all those glass rooms and turn off the air conditioning and put machines into the hands of everyone. And now we're going back again to a form of time sharing, but now it's called cloud computing. And it's arguably, by analogy, the same thing.
It goes back and forth. It's a kind of an interesting psychological thing, that computing is on the mainframe, and then it's on the server, and then it's on a standalone computer, and then part of it is on the server again. And each one of those gets a sort of a different name, which I'll go into in a minute as we talk about open source.
Right. And what I'm gonna do, Larry, just so we have it on the screen, is I'm gonna screen share for a second, because sometimes we actually put up YouTubes. This is a picture that was taken of a Dartmouth student with the GE. General Electric was then in the mini computer business, a GE 635 time sharing system at what's called the Kiewit Computation Center at Dartmouth College. And the guy's got the Dartmouth jacket on. That's not you, is it? I guess it could be with dark hair.
It does not look like me.
Yeah.
But it could have been.
It could have been you.
And that terminal there is a memory evoker,
right,
certainly with paper tape on the side and the ability to type in commands and get this computer in the background to do its thing. I was there after the Kiewit Computer Center.
Right. But you were there in the early days, and you were a little bit like me, which is you were initially thought, I'm going into computer science. I got the degree in computer science and was working as a programmer in the mainframe center of City University in Manhattan. That expensive real estate was used in Manhattan to house a big IBM set of IBM 370 machines. And yes, we still punched cards to run either Fortran or PL1 programs back then.
Well, to put it in context, since we're both compatriots in age, when I went to Stanford, the students were required to punch card their programs and bring them to the computer center and run them that way. And I kept telling them, and I don't want to take credit for this, but that the way to do that is not to have punch cards for students, but to have terminals for students to do that.
Right.
And they accepted that idea, and they developed that idea, and during the time that I was at Stanford, they evolved into a system where students sat at terminals and keyed in their programs and worked with time sharing systems on the computer center that I was working at.
And the gentleman that we're thinking about, his name was John Kemeny, right? Isn't that the gentleman we're thinking about?
John Kemeny was at that time professor of math and science at Dartmouth and became its president, as a matter of fact.
Right. So you go from this background in computer science and an actual job as a computer scientist to deciding to go to law school. How did that happen?
Well, I'm not there yet. Many years to go still.
Okay.
So after about 9 or 10 years at Stanford, things were changing in the industry. Apple was getting started. There were new technologies being developed. And I decided that as a non-PhD, continuing at Stanford was not the future for me. And so what I did is I got into industry and I became a programmer, more than a programmer, a manager at a PBX company, a company that I'm sure you've heard of called Rome.
Oh yeah. There was a phone company. That's the old phone system that was based on a computer running the phone system. ROLM. That was a big client of my old law firm, Davis, Stafford, Kelman, and Fenwick. Rome was a big client for them back in the 70s.
I vaguely remember, I don't know if you were the one or not, but you were an attorney dealing with artificial intelligence and had Rome as a client doing some artificial intelligence software.
Yeah, I mean, they were ahead of their time, but, I think that's technology changes so fast that, sort of switching technology for phone systems really changes as fast, if not more fast, than even computer systems. I mean, they're all linked together now in many ways. I mean, look at what we're doing with Zoom. This would be unheard of years ago, to have a free video conference that you can record without charge for the first 30 or 40 minutes, however long they give you these days. Sometimes it's longer, depending on what their load is. It's kind of an amazing system. And to be able to share a screen, as I'm doing, and say, oh, look, I see a picture of John Kemeny along with Thomas Kurtz, and there they are in a picture talking about how they selected the GE 225 as the system that was going to replace whatever the earlier system was, and how they staked out this view that computer science would be a big part of Dartmouth, right?
I was there at the time. And some of the stuff that was going on at this PBX company involved me dealing with something of called ISDN and the ability to combine voice and data on a phone line.
Right.
With the capability of bandwidth that was just barely able to do it. But those were data communications capabilities in their PBX system.
Right. That was a big addition to their system, to be able to do that and enable the beginning of messaging as part of what would happen on a desktop device. Like literally, you can get a message that comes over a little LCD screen that says, hey, somebody's on the line. Do you want to break into this call? That sort of thing, where people could actually use their time better, because it's all about human potential and how human potential is being taken advantage of over the maybe 100 years or so that we're lucky enough to live, if we live that long, right?
So one of the things I did while I was there was co-author of an invention, a patented invention, for an all-digital modem, so that one could use your phone for phone purposes and simultaneously use it for data purposes.
Nice.
In a digital way. Anyway, was that
when the itch occurred to become a lawyer, when you started dealing with patent lawyers?
Actually, that's where I started to become interested in patent law. I was responsible at Rome for their trademark activities and frequently advised them on patents and other forms of intellectual property. I became interested in it. I was always interested in it, but after a while it became clear that as a technologist, you have to grow or you retire. And so what I did is I became interested in law school. I applied to law school and was able to go to law school at night while I continued to work at Rome until I became a lawyer.
That's like having two jobs at once. That's like working 18 hours a day.
It was quite fun. My weeks and weekends were very full, and it was the most wonderful educational experience of my life.
And you look back on those days and say, man, that was freedom back then. I didn't have to deal with any clients. I could just study and enjoy myself. And I had a sense of freedom back then doing both roles, because there's an analogy for me, which is I got the graduate degree in computer science while working a day job doing programming, and often being in the same computing center where part of the work that was being done was writing programs for the classes. So I transitioned from production work to sort of more experimental work. And it was an interesting period because you don't often get a chance to kind of be on both sides of academia and production where you're doing both parts, because the production people are just get it done. We don't care whether it's elegant or not. And the academics are like, you want to write some elegant code. I have to read it, put some comments in it. And the people in production are like, just get it done. Get us the friggin' report. We just want the report. Process the data. We don't care how you write it. It could take forever. We'll give you the machine time. They used to say to me, we'll give you the extra machine time. Just get it done. We don't care how elegant it's going to run. We just want it done. So it's an interesting contrast. And in a way, that's a little bit like law school, because you do have to do things as lawyers where you say, man, I wish I had more time. I would be able to write a shorter brief or a shorter complaint than what's written, right? Because the time deadlines actually prevent you from editing stuff down. So how did you get involved in open source? Because that's a major, major innovation, and you're a big player in it.
Well, what happened was I graduated from law school and decided that it was no longer of value to me to be at Rome. So I went off to become a lawyer, and not as a young person anymore. I took a job in a firm that specialized in personal injury stuff. And I did that for about 9 or 10 months. And I said, what the hell am I doing? That has nothing to do with me. It's not what I am. I mean, it's fascinating. I learned about it. I was able to, do case management conferences and arbitrations and depositions and all that kind of stuff. But it had nothing to do with me. I was interested in computers. And of course, over the years, I had developed friendships with many people who were in the computer field, and talked to them and worked with them and befriended them, as I always used to do. And one of them was someone who said, I've got this guy that I work with that I'm talking to named Richard Stallman, who has a question. Can you help answer his question? And I had an opportunity to talk to Richard Stallman, which is an experience in itself, and was able to tell him that his desire was not compatible with the law. And
what people need to know, because you and I know Richard Stallman, and both of us see him as a real pioneer in trying to suggest that, hey, software needs to be free, information needs to be free. Everyone has a right to information. Everyone has a right to use software. There should be freedom. It should be completely, I don't know if he went as far as to say all public domain or mostly public domain. And he was viewed as kind of like an outrageous voice, almost like a Bernie Sanders.
Actually, his question was an important one. And our internet connection is unstable, but I'm going to try to answer it anyway.
Okay.
It's an important question that became an important question for me to address ultimately in my book, and remains a question to this day, which is, he said, look, I've developed this license which requires that if you publish software under my license, that any derivative works that you create using my work have to also be published under that same license. And that seemed like an interesting and logical and friendly and appropriate objective. And then he said, but what I really want is I want collective works. I want works that merely touch my work to have to release their software. And I said, you can't do that. That derivative work is something special.
I'm putting your book on the screen because I want to make sure your book is up there. And I think you're talking this book because you've done several, the open source licensing, software freedom, and intellectual property law book, right? That's the one we're talking about.
That's the same book. That's
right.
Correct.
And I think Stallman's view was a little bit like, hey, can we stretch some copyright principles in a direction that's sometimes called copy left principles, LEFT, sort of a play on words, to say, I really want anyone that's inspired by my software to effectively join into the group that says it should be open. And you gave him advice that said, you can't do that. That's not even a derivative work. That's like an inspiration, right? He wanted to tie together this whole community of free software, or what might be called open source software today, right?
Correct. So I ended up arguing with Richard Stallman, but at the same time I discovered, again through the contacts I had made, the friends that I had made in the business, that there were other organizations that were beginning to be formed that had a somewhat different philosophical basis for what they were trying to do with open source than did Richard Stallman and the Free Software Foundation. And I found that to be intellectually more compatible with what I believe the limitations are of copyright law and of the ability to affect other works through your work.
Right, right.
And that was the Open Source Initiative, which had just recently been formed. And I became the general counsel for Open Source Initiative.
Which means you're like the fire chief of the fire department that hears about all the situations that result in fires that have to be put out, controversies of one sort or another, right? Realistically?
That's exactly right. I became the person who could articulate that there were business reasons for free and open source software that were, at least in the copyright law sense, different from what the Free Software Foundation was trying to accomplish. Not that they were wrong, but that they were, in my view, extending copyright beyond what the copyright law required.
Right. And if you look at your preamble to your book, you note in February of 1989, Richard Stallman first released his GNU project software for Unix under version 1 of the GNU General Public License. In June of that same year, Bill Joy first released a free version of Unix software under the University of California, Berkeley Software Distribution, the BSD license. These relatively quiet events signaled a new era for software licensing. I think that really captures your point that these two gentlemen really caused a bit of a revolution that, oddly enough, Microsoft looks like they're trying to bear hug in their purchase of GitHub, but in a positive way. I mean, I'd like your views on that, because Microsoft acquired GitHub, which is viewed as like the major repository of most open source worldwide, but it looks like they're not trying to do anything that distorts the mission. It looks like it's very much part of, let's build a bigger and better open source community, right?
Well, you're summarizing a whole bunch of history.
Right.
So let me not jump to the conclusion quite as quickly as you just did.
Okay.
Essentially, there were, at the time, two different philosophies for open source. There was the philosophy of the Free Software Foundation, which involved the declaration that if you create a derivative work, you must reciprocate by licensing it under the same license. Meanwhile, there were other people who said, we agree with the notion of fair distribution of the software, but we don't want to obligate the downstream licensees in terms of what they have to do with the software. If they want to take it and put it into commercial or private or trade secret software, that was allowed. And so they had both the GPL and the BSD license as the articulated standards for two different versions. And what distinguished the Free Software Foundation from the Open Source Initiative was that the Open Source Initiative accepted both.
Okay.
And they said it makes no difference in terms of the free software nature of it that you be or not be required to reciprocate. Reciprocation is a licensor's choice. And so both sets of licenses were going to be allowed. Then I became their general counsel and began to work with the notion that different commercial entities wanted to articulate different balancing acts between those two things. And it became important to understand what are the requirements for trademarks, what are the requirements for derivative works, what are the requirements for patents. We had a big meeting in San Francisco late in the 90s in the open source movement, and it became clear that copyrights was just not enough.
Right.
That there are also other things. And so the question came up, what about reciprocity with respect to patents? Or what about with respect to defensive termination of patent rights?
Right. Because you had in parallel the growth not only of copyright protection and explicit statutory protection under the 1980 software amendment to the Copyright Act. Explicit, what was previously there was made explicit, but you had all of these cases running through the patent office and then eventually the US Supreme Court saying, yes, software can be patented. Even pure software can be patented. Of course, we zigzag a lot even in those realms as well. But I want to draw an analogy for a second and make you comment on this or ask you to comment on this. Imagine Hollywood had a version of open source scripts where every script was put into a repository and was basically, these were all the scripts that were rejected by Hollywood. And essentially they were open source and available for anyone and everyone to try to lever up to create a new script. But that new script had to go to open source too, but someone could presumably implement the script with a big budget or no big budget to implement the movie. Do you think we'd have better movies over time, or do you think, no, that's a stupid idea? Scripts and software are very different. Software does work, a script is entertainment. But I think Hollywood is a lot more strict on how they protect scripts that are even the rejected scripts they protect. Often they deep six them or treat them as confidential or otherwise wrap very strong copyright rights around them. And those scripts never really get used for anything. And whatever ideas were in there that could have been taken advantage of get completely lost.
I have a cousin who went to Yale and became a musician, studied how to play music, classical music primarily. She was a violist. And when I told her at the time that I was into this new thing called open source, she said, how could you possibly do that? As a musician, I have to earn my money. When I write something, I want to make sure that I'm paid for my work. And I said, well, Mozart isn't paid. Beethoven isn't paid anymore.
Right.
There's something about the freedom to do things with a work that is not articulated clearly in the Constitution. In order to promote the progress of science and the useful arts.
Yes.
What does that mean? What does it mean to have progress? Does the freedom to copy, in some sense, Mickey Mouse encourage the freedom, encourage the progress of the arts? And the answer is, in some sense, yes, and in some sense, no. And the way I articulate the difference is, first of all, I agree with Lessig that the term of copyright and the term of patent
Way too long.
More limited.
Way too long, right?
It's way too long.
Way too long.
Way too long. In light of the progress that human beings are making in their lives
Right.
and in science and the useful arts. But at the same time, we need to protect the right of the author or inventor to profit from his work. And that balancing act is something that needs to be articulated clearly, and the only place to articulate it, and here's where my own personal intellectual background came into effect, it has to be articulated in licenses.
Right.
There's no other place to put it.
Right.
You don't put it in law, and you don't put it in wishful thinking. And so what we did in OSI, which was at the time, I think, very effective, but at the same time a mistake, was we encouraged companies and individuals and others with ideas about where that balance goes to develop new and different licenses and to include terms in those licenses that attempted to articulate what that balance was, including things like, what are the jurisdictions for fighting these things? What are the reciprocal rights that you're granting? What does it mean to say that you have a trademark provision and trademarks appear in the software, but they're not used as trademarks in the software? They're used as labels. When you have a patent and you wish to be able to use it in a defensive manner to protect the software that you're releasing for free, what are the limits of that defensive termination? I remember IBM got very heated about wanting to defend all of their patents. If we release software and you sue us over that software with respect to patents, then you lose your license to all of our patents.
Right. So,
and that became a very heated debate, not just with me, but within the open source community as to whether, for example, HP could not live with that restriction, with that articulation of defensive. And so when they developed other software development organizations, they had to negotiate between themselves and with OSI as to what the limits were going to be. And that created a broad diversity of licenses to the point that people were saying to themselves, there's too many licenses. We can't, open source is more complicated than anything else because I have 100 licenses to choose from. And if I choose this one, I get this. If I choose that one, I get that. And if I combine two pieces of software, at what level do they combine? At what level do they interact? At which level will these two licenses cause conflicts with respect to derivative or collective works, or with respect to patents, or with respect to trademarks, or with respect to attribution notices that you're required? Certain companies came in and said, we're willing to live with just attribution. Well, does that mean I have to put a big neon sign on my software that says I wrote it? No, it can't possibly mean that, but it does mean something. And to articulate this clearly, open source has not stopped arguing those battles.
Yeah, and it's odd because a lot of the pioneers like yourself are getting older, yourself, myself, and others. And I don't know that there's really a next generation that's picking this up from what I would call the philosophical, help us clarify the law. I mean, even Larry Lessig is getting older. And, as these older guys and gals get older and older, I don't know that the new generation even cares that much. They just kind of assume it's all going to work out. And as we know, this stuff doesn't necessarily work out. It doesn't necessarily work out unless someone puts in the pro bono time, which you've done a lot of pro bono to try to get this stuff to work. And it tends to be a lot of time and a lot of effort. I do it as well. And there are a lot of cases that people are still arguing about simple things, like really simple things, like can you just have one file with all the licenses, or somehow you have to put it in separate files and give separate attribution? Can you have one legal.txt file where people go to look at the list of all the licenses? I mean, convenience has to win out somewhere in this too, right?
Well, what I have tried to do in my own work on it. First of all, I want to address your point first, and then I'll tell you about what I would want to do with it. I disagree with you that we've sort of reached an end stage where there's just too much complexity to it. Here's some examples. A recent extensive debate about licenses in the open source world had to do with the way the data that is used in a software package is licensed. So if I release a software package, along with the data that is designed to make it work, to configure it, to test it, whatever, if someone takes and makes a derivative work of their software, do they also have to give you the derivative work of their data?
Well, you know, years ago, Larry, as you know, years ago, the data used to be compiled with the software program together as one ginormous package, and that all changed once relational databases became part of the scene and we started separating the data. So it's an interesting question, because I remember when I testified in the Copyright Office about what should we do with respect to making these software amendments to the Copyright Act real, a lot of the questions were, what are we going to do with data? Because they thought of data as different and as something that you could not necessarily get copyright protection on or any protection on. And yet we know there's some real value in data, as is proven by the $1 trillion valuation of Amazon, which has got ginormous compilations of data, huge compilations of data.
And so these are not trivial problems. And so when you sort of say, well, we've sort of reached a stage where open source is just getting to be too complicated, it really is not. Let me give you the most complicated issue that I think is before the Supreme Court today, which is that software is not just lines of code that can be treated as a literary work. It is also a set of instructions about how to make something happen.
Yeah, you're talking about the Oracle Google case now, right?
Precisely.
Right.
Where you have an API, an application program interface, which says this is how something happens.
Yes.
This is the method and the mode of operation.
Right.
And to what extent is that to be licensed under or controlled by the copyright aspect of the law or the patent aspect of the law?
Or maybe no aspect of the law. Or maybe neither. Or maybe neither, as in once you publish it, it's like just giving people open keys to this is the way you use my software, period, full stop. Almost like a compulsory, obligatory license. But Larry, we're out of time, and I want to do a part 2 after Oracle versus Google is decided, and we can look at whether Bill Joy's vision is really playing out here, or whether some other vision that now I guess Larry Ellison's in control of for Oracle is playing out. We're out of time, but let's plan on a part 2. You're looking great. I'm going to come up and visit your farm up there at some point and convince you to sell it to me if you decide to sell it at some point in your life, because you got a beautiful farm up there with a lot of acreage.
I do, and you're welcome anytime. And I've got to tell you, you can't see with the camera, but the sky is beautiful today. The weather is beautiful today. And even though I'm in a wheelchair paddling around instead of walking, I encourage you with your sore hips to go walking around and enjoying the weather and enjoying the farm.
Absolutely. I'm going to come up and visit you, but you take care. We're going to do another one of these. Maybe we'll do it in person from your farm about the Oracle versus Google case once that comes out, either later this year or next year.
It depends. I may be in tears.
All right.
Don't know what's
No, you stay healthy. You get better. You look great, man. We'll talk again. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good afternoon.
next time on the Valley Current.